Do you believe in haunted houses? What if I told you that true terror isn't always in plain sight? Imagine finding your dream home, only to discover that it holds dark and frightening secrets. Julia and Marcos just wanted to start their lives over, but they ended up unleashing something that should never be disturbed. Today, I'm going to take you inside this terrifying story, where fear has a name, an address, and is waiting in the basement. Get ready, because you'll never look at your home the same way again. Let's get started with this mysterious story, but first, quickly check if you're already subscribed to the channel. That way, you'll be sure not to miss any of the most chilling stories we've prepared especially for you. Continuing. Julia and Marcos were looking for a fresh start. After years of living in the chaos of the big city, they decided it was time to trade the noise of horns for the sound of birds and the polluted air for a place where they could breathe in peace. It was in a small town in the countryside that they found what seemed to be the perfect opportunity. It was a sunny day when they arrived in the area, guided by a simple but intriguing advertisement. Old house for sale, unbeatable price. As soon as they turned the last bend in the road, they saw the house for the first time. It stood majestically at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by trees that seemed as old as time. With its imposing structure and tall windows, the house exuded a charm that mixed nostalgia and mystery. The real estate agent was waiting for them at the entrance. He was a thin, reserved man with a smile that seemed forced. "You're lucky," he said as he opened the rusty iron gate. "This house is a rare gem. It needs some repairs, but at the price we're asking, you won't find anything better." Julia and Marcos couldn't believe what they were hearing. The price was a real bargain, almost too good to be true. But as soon as they entered the property, they felt something different. It wasn't exactly discomfort, but a kind of heaviness in the air, as if the house was watching them, awaiting their approval. Inside, the house was even more impressive. Large rooms with stone fireplaces, a high ceiling decorated with wooden beams, and a staircase that looked like something out of an old movie. Even with the signs of neglect, accumulated dust, furniture covered in sheets, and a faint smell of mold, Julia saw potential. "With a good renovation, this place will be amazing," she said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. Marcos, however, had his doubts. He wasn't much of a believer in premonitions, but something about the house made him uneasy. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he asked, looking at his wife, who was already walking excitedly around the old kitchen, imagining what it would be like to have friends and family gathered there. The realtor, noticing Marcos's hesitation, quickly intervened. "There are many stories about this house. It's an old building and some people like to create rumors, things about the past, but nothing that needs to worry you." He laughed nervously, but his words planted a seed of curiosity in Marcos. Ignoring any hint of doubt, Julia persisted. "It's perfect, Marcos, and it's within our budget. When else would we have a chance like this?" Reluctantly, but wanting to please his wife, he agreed. The contract was signed on the spot, and within days, Julia and Marcos were the new owners of the mysterious house. As they drove back to the city to organize the move, Julia could not contain her excitement, while Marcos drove in silence, taking one last look at the house in the rearview mirror. There in the upstairs window, he swore he saw something or someone moving quickly. He blinked and the figure disappeared. "It must have been my imagination," he thought. But deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning. A few days after signing the contract, Julia and Marcos began exploring the small town where their new home was located. It was a quiet place, with cobblestone streets, small old shops, and residents who seemed to have known each other for decades. It was in a cozy cafe in the city center that the first rumors began to emerge. As they sipped hot coffee and waited for a slice of apple pie, Julia could not contain her excitement. She told the waiter, an elderly gentleman with watchful eyes and calloused hands, about the purchase of the house. "We are so excited. That house is beautiful. It has so much potential. As soon as the words left her mouth, the mood in the cafe changed. The waiter, who had been smiling in a friendly way until then, became serious. Other customers sitting nearby began to whisper, casting discreet but intrigued glances in the couple's direction. "Did you buy that house?" the waiter asked, his voice low and full of a weight that Julia could not interpret. Marcos, noticing the change in tone, answered hesitantly, "Yes, we found a good deal. Why? Is there something wrong with it?" The man looked around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "You should have asked more before buying. That house has history." He sighed as if the words were hard to say. "History?" Julia leaned forward, curious. "What kind of history?" "Stories that are not for the faint of heart," answered a woman sitting at a nearby table. She was a white-haired lady with a stern expression. She approached, bringing with her an air of mystery. "That house used to be beautiful, yes, but something changed many years ago. Helena Moraes lived there with her family, and they disappeared." Disappeared? Julia felt a shiver run down her spine. "All of them at once," the lady continued. "They say her husband, Eduardo, went crazy, but others believe it was the house itself that consumed them. Since then, no one has been able to live there for long. Strange things always happen." "Like what?" Marcos insisted, trying to sound skeptical but feeling the tension in the air. "Noises at night, voices that no one can explain, objects that move by themselves. Some say they've seen lights coming from the basement, even when the house was empty." "Basement?" Julia repeated, remembering the locked door they'd noticed the day they'd visited. "You may not believe it," the woman said, her eyes fixed on Julia's. "But be careful. There are things in that house that don't want to be disturbed." The couple tried to laugh off the story, but their nervousness was palpable. As they left the cafe, the conversation kept echoing in their minds. Julia was still determined to make the house a home. Marcos, on the other hand, was beginning to feel like they'd gotten involved in something bigger and more dangerous than they could have imagined. As they walked down the street, Julia squeezed Marcos's arm. "Do you think they're exaggerating? Just small-town legends, right?" Marcos forced a smile and shook his head, but inside he felt a growing unease. Deep down, they both knew that those stories could be true. They just didn't know how much it would affect them. And, worse, what was waiting for them inside the basement. Moving into the house was an event full of expectations. Julia and Marcos spent the first day organizing boxes, cleaning the rooms and imagining what their new life there would be like. As the sun set, the air in the house seemed to change, as if an invisible shadow began to spread through the corners. On the first night, while they were unpacking books in the living room, a strange sound echoed through the house. A light scratching, like nails running across the floor. Marcos raised his head, frowning. "Did you hear that?" "It must be the wind," Julia replied, trying not to care. But inside he felt a chill. The window was closed, and the sound was coming from inside the house. Later, as they were getting ready for bed, something else happened. Julia, when she opened her suitcase to get her pajamas, realized that something was wrong. A gold necklace that she always kept carefully stored had disappeared. "Did you touch this?" she asked Marcos. "No," he replied, already lying on the bed. "Maybe it was in another box." Julia tried to forget the incident, but the discomfort persisted. During the night, she was awakened by a muffled noise coming from downstairs. It was a rhythmic sound, almost like slow footsteps. She shook Marcos. "Did you hear that?" He got up reluctantly, grabbing a flashlight. "It's probably the old plumbing, or maybe a rat." Together, they went downstairs, lighting their way. The living room was empty. Everything seemed to be in its place, except for one detail. One of the boxes they had left in the corner was open, with objects scattered across the floor. "Did you open that?" Marcos asked, looking at Julia. "Of course not," she replied, feeling her anxiety grow. They gathered the items in silence, both trying to rationalize what could have happened. But deep down, the idea that something was wrong began to take hold. Over the next few days, other small events continued to occur. Objects would disappear or reappear in strange places. One night, while washing dishes, Julia felt a slight, cold breeze pass over her neck, even though no windows were opened. Marcos began to notice shadows that seemed to move in the corner of his eye, but when he turned around, there was nothing there. The most disturbing episode occurred a week after moving in. While organizing the guest room, they found an old toy that wasn't theirs. A small wooden horse with faded paint and a strangely somber expression. Was this here before? Marcos asked, holding the toy carefully. No, Julia replied, her voice low. I've never seen it before. They tried to ignore the find, but the wooden horse seemed charged with an energy that made the room seem colder. Julia insisted that the object be thrown away, and Marcos agreed, putting it in a bag and leaving it outside to be thrown out. The next morning, when they went out into the yard, the horse was back on the kitchen doorstep. They both remained silent, staring at the toy. The discomfort that had once been easy to ignore now seemed impossible to dismiss. Something was wrong in that house, and they were only beginning to understand how deep it could be. After days of dealing with the strange events in the house, Julia and Marcos began to explore the rooms more thoroughly. There was something mysterious in every corner of that old house, but one detail caught their attention more than the others. The basement door. It was a thick wooden door marked by time with several layers of peeling paint. Rusty padlocks sealed it tightly and thick chains wrapped around it, as if something or someone wanted to ensure that no one would ever open it. It was located in the back hallway, almost hidden, as if the architecture itself tried to keep it out of sight. Did you notice this when we first visited the house? Julia asked, leaning in to take a closer look. Yes, but I thought it was just an unused area, Marcos replied, crouching down to touch the chains. They looked even older up close, as if they had been there for decades. What could be down there? Julia's curiosity was palpable. The idea of something locked up for so long intrigued and, at the same time, unsettled her. Probably just a regular basement, Marcos said, trying to sound casual, but his expression betrayed a slight discomfort. Maybe it's empty or full of old things that no one wanted to take. Julia knocked lightly on the door. The sound echoed muffledly, as if the space on the other side were vast. She squinted and put her ear against the wood, hoping to hear something. There was only silence, but a heavy silence, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. We need a key or some tool to open this, she suggested. Julia, what if it's locked for a good reason? Marcos retorted, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. Or what if it's just something old that was left here? It could be a useful place to store things after we clean it up. Julius's insistence made Marcos back off, but he didn't like the idea of messing with the door at all. Something deep inside him told him it was better to leave it as it was. During the following nights, the door seemed to occupy a constant place in both of their thoughts. The mystery of the basement began to take over their conversations, even when they tried to change the subject. Until one morning, while Marcos was sleeping, Julius was woken up by a low, almost imperceptible sound. It was like a distant creaking coming from the hallway. She sat up in bed, holding her breath. "Marcos," she whispered, shaking him. He groaned, half groggily. "I think I heard something coming from the basement." Marcos slowly opened his eyes, but before he could say anything, the sound came again. A soft but distinct click. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, like something was trying to tamper with the locks. The couple exchanged a worried look. Marcos picked up the flashlight next to the bed, and together they walked down the stairs in silence. When they reached the hallway, the basement door looked exactly as it had before, intact, with the padlocks and chains in place. But the air around it was different. There was a peculiar smell, something between mold and rusty iron. And the hallway was colder than the rest of the house, as if the basement itself was emanating an icy breeze. "You heard that, didn't you?" Julia asked, holding Marcos's arm tightly. "Yes," he replied, shining the flashlight on the door. But there were no signs that anyone or anything had tampered with it. "Should we call someone?" Julia suggested. "Call who? A locksmith? A priest?" Marcos replied, trying to lighten the mood, but the nervousness in his voice was evident. Unable to get any answers, the two decided to go back to the bedroom. But the mystery of the basement door became even more present. Something in that house seemed to want to be found, or perhaps something down there was trying to get out. The attempt to open the basement, the days passed, but the basement door became an obsession for Julia. She couldn't get it out of her head. Why was it locked so carefully? What could someone have hidden there? Every time she passed through the hallway, she felt as if the door was calling her, as if the mystery behind it intensified with each passing second. Marcos, on the other hand, wanted to avoid the subject at all costs. "Julia, please let it go. It's just an old basement, and if it was something important, the realtor would have told us. Or maybe he didn't want to tell us precisely because there's something important there," she replied, resolute. One Saturday morning, while Marcos was in the backyard trying to fix the fence, Julia decided to take action. She found a large pair of pliers in the toolbox and went to the basement. Her hands trembled as she approached the door, but curiosity was stronger than fear. The chains were rusty, but firm. She tried several times to cut the metal with the pliers, but the effort only served to increase the noise in the hallway. "What the hell?" she muttered, sweaty and frustrated. Marcos came running in, startled by the sound. "Julia, what are you doing?" He looked at her, holding the pliers, his face red with effort. "I need to know what's in here, Marcos. I can't stand this strange feeling anymore." "Are you listening to yourself? Why does it matter so much? If it's locked, there must be a good reason why we shouldn't open it." But Julia was adamant. "What if there's something valuable in there? What if it's dangerous? We live here now, Marcos. We have to know what's behind this door." After much debate, Marcos finally gave in. He went to the garage and came back with a small chainsaw. "If we're going to do this, let's do it right away, but don't say I didn't warn you." The sound of the saw cutting through the metal echoed through the house like a warning. The chains finally broke, falling to the floor with a crash that seemed louder than it should have been. Julia held her breath as Marcos removed the rusty padlock and pushed the door open. The wood creaked loudly, revealing a steep staircase that descended into darkness. A strong, unpleasant smell escaped, like a mixture of damp earth and something rotten. Marcos's flashlight illuminated the top of the stairs, but the light seemed swallowed up by the darkness below. "I don't like this," he said, holding Julia's arm. "We need to go down," she insisted, her voice low but determined. The two of them began to descend the stairs, step by step, with the flashlight shaking in Marcos's hands. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of their breathing. When they reached the bottom, they realized that the basement was larger than they had imagined. The stone walls were covered in moss, and the floor was dirt. In the center of the space, there was something unexpected, an old table full of strange objects, melted candles, dusty books, and symbols drawn on the floor. Julia ran her fingers over one of the books, feeling the texture of the old leather. She opened the cover, revealing pages filled with symbols and words in a language she didn't recognize. "This looks like a ritual," Marcos said, his voice trembling. Before they could react, a sudden noise made them freeze. Something fell to the floor, rolling near their feet. Julia shined her flashlight and saw a small object, the wooden horse they had discarded days ago. "How did this get here?" Julia whispered, feeling her heart race. Marcos grabbed her arm. "Let's get out of here now!" But before they could move, The sound of footsteps began to echo in the basement. They were not alone. Something or someone was there with them, hidden in the darkness. And it seemed to be getting closer and closer. The encounter with the presence in the basement. The footsteps were slow, shuffling, but getting closer. The flashlight trembled in Marcos's hands, its flickering light dancing across the basement walls. Julia gripped his arm tightly, her heart beating so fast she felt like it was going to explode. "Who's there?" Marcos tried to sound firm, but his voice came out weak, almost a whisper. There was no response, only the continuous sound of footsteps, now accompanied by a light scratching, like nails going through the earth. The darkness seemed to come alive, filling the space with a palpable presence. Julia shined her light into the corner where the noise was coming from, but there was nothing visible. "Marcos, maybe we should go out," she said, her courage starting to waver. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. It was an oppressive emptiness, as if the entire basement was holding its breath, waiting for the next movement. Before they could move, a low, almost imperceptible laugh cut through the air. It was a childish laugh, but it was filled with something dark that made both of their blood run cold. Julia quickly turned to the source of the sound, but once again there was nothing there. "Julia, let's get out of here, now!" Marcos insisted, pulling her by the arm, but Julia stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the table in the center of the basement. Something was changing. The symbols drawn on the floor began to glow, a faint red that grew in intensity. The air grew heavier and the temperature dropped dramatically. Then came the sound, a loud crack followed by a deep, low groan that seemed to come from within the earth itself. A crack formed in the floor, right in the center of the symbols. From within it, something began to emerge. It was a shadow, an indefinite figure that seemed to float between the tangible and the ethereal. It had a humanoid shape, but its contours were blurred, as if it were made of black smoke. Two glowing dots where the eyes should have been fixed on Julia and Marcos, and the laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through the basement. Julia took a step back, stumbling and almost falling. Marcos caught her, but his eyes were fixed on the figure. What is that?" The figure began to move slowly toward them, each step bringing with it a wave of cold. Marcos's flashlight began to fail, flickering until it went out completely, leaving the couple in total darkness. Julia squinted, trying to adjust to the darkness. She grabbed Marcos's hand, but realized that he was shaking just as much as she was. "Run," he whispered. Before they could react, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The figure's laughter turned into an agonized scream, full of rage and despair, echoing off the walls. "Marcos, the door!" Julia shouted, pulling him. They ran blindly, guided only by the memory of the path they had taken to the stairs. But each step seemed more difficult. The air became dense, as if something was pulling them back. Finally, the light from the stairs appeared, weak but enough to guide them. Marcos reached the door and began to pull desperately, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked again! Push, Marcos! Push as hard as you can!" With one last effort, the door opened, and the two stumbled out, falling into the hallway. As soon as they were out, the basement door slammed shut again on its own, with a force that made the entire house shake. They stood there, panting and silent, staring at the closed door. Julia began to cry, and Marcos, still holding the broken flashlight, tried to hug her, but his own hands were shaking too much. "I told you we shouldn't open it," he murmured, his voice thick with fear and regret. "Marcos, that wasn't human," Julia said, her eyes wide. "I don't know what it was, but I know we have to get out of here, now." Without arguing, the two ran out of the house, leaving the basement door locked behind them. But as they left, they couldn't ignore the sound coming from inside. The same childish laughter, now mixed with incomprehensible whispers, as if the entire house were alive and watching. The revelation and the warning after. Running out of the house, Julia and Marcos stopped on the street, panting. The cold of the night seemed more welcoming than the oppressive air of the house. They looked at the windows, which now seemed darker, almost as if they were covered by an internal shadow. The light that should have been on in the living room had disappeared, leaving the house plunged into darkness. "We can't stay here anymore," Marcos said, breaking the silence. "We need to leave." Julia just nodded, still hugging her body, as if trying to protect herself from something invisible. Without wasting any more time, they got in the car and drove to the house of a close friend, Lucas, who greeted them with concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" he asked, seeing the two in a clearly shaken state. Julia started to explain, but her words came out disjointed. The house, the basement. There was something down there. Something that shouldn't be there. Lucas frowned but decided not to press. "Maybe it's better if you stay here tonight. Tomorrow we can try to understand better what happened." The couple spent the night awake, discussing what they had seen and felt. Julia, in particular, couldn't get the childish laughter and the figure's bright eyes out of her head. There was something deeply wrong in that house, something that went beyond her understanding. The next morning, they decided to look for answers. They went to the local library and began researching the history of the house, especially the rumors and legends that neighbors had mentioned. So, have you ever heard of the haunted house story? Leave a comment with what you know about it, and if you believe in these stories, continuing. It was then that they found an old entry in a local newspaper. The house had belonged decades ago to a family named Fontana. The headline was disturbing. "Family disappears mysteriously. House gains reputation as cursed." Marcos read aloud. The Fontanas were known for being reserved, but neighbors often reported strange sounds coming from the house during the night. One morning, after a series of screams were heard, the house was found empty. All the family members had disappeared without a trace. "That doesn't explain the basement," said Julia, eager for more answers. But as they continued reading, they found something that chilled their bones. The newspaper mentioned that during the investigation, the police had found strange symbols in the basement, as well as reports from neighbor children about an invisible friend who called them to play near the house. "The symbols," Julia whispered, "and the wooden horse. It was down there." Marcus closed the newspaper, trying to process what they had discovered. "We need help, Julia. This isn't something we can handle alone." That afternoon, they went to a woman they knew in the area, Donna Esther, a long-time resident and an expert on local history. Upon hearing her story, they realized that the truth was even darker than they had imagined. "You opened the basement, didn't you?" she asked, her face serious. "Yes," Julia replied, her voice wavering. Donna Esther sighed deeply. "That house carries a curse. They say the Fontanas practiced rituals to attract something that promised power and protection. But they opened a door that should never have been opened. And now, what they brought here cannot leave, but it also does not want to be forgotten." Julia and Marcos looked at each other, the weight of the revelation falling on them like a stone. "What can we do?" Marcos asked. "You've already done the worst thing possible. You opened the basement. Now the house knows you're there, and it won't let you off the hook. My advice, get out, leave the house behind and never come back." "But what if someone else goes in there? What if someone gets hurt?" Julia asked. Donna Esther shook her head. "There's not much you can do. The house is a magnet for the curious and the brave. Just pray that no one else makes the same mistake." That night, Julia and Marcos decided never to return. They hired a lawyer to try to sell the house, but they soon discovered that no one wanted to buy it. The mystery and rumors surrounding it were too well known. But even far away, the horror did not completely leave them. Sometimes, during the night, Julia still heard the child's laughter in her dreams, and Marcos, from time to time, saw shadows in the corner of his eye that disappeared when he turned around. The house was still there, silent and waiting. And whatever was in the basement knew that sooner or later someone would come back to open the door again. Julia and Marcos tried to move on, but it was as if the house had left an invisible mark on their lives. They moved to a small apartment in the city, far from the neighborhood where the abandoned house was located. Still, the feeling of being watched never left them. Julia began to have recurring nightmares, always the same scenario. She was in the basement with the chains intact on the door. On the other side, something was knocking insistently, asking to be let in. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move, as if the darkness itself had trapped her. Marcos, on the other hand, began to experience strange events while he was awake. Objects would fall inexplicably around him, whispers would echo in empty rooms, and he would feel an icy presence behind him, but there was never anything there. One night, while they were both trying to sleep, Julia woke up to a distinct sound, the jingling of chains. Her heart raced, and she turned to wake Marcos, but he was already sitting up in bed, his eyes wide open. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low and full of fear. Julia nodded, and the two of them fell silent, trying to identify the source of the sound. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the living room, as if something heavy had fallen. They looked at each other, both terrified, but they knew they had to check. With a flashlight in hand, Marcos led the way, while Julia followed closely behind. When they reached the living room, they found the painting that had been on the wall lying on the floor, the glass shattered into pieces. But what caught Marcos's attention was the reflection that Marcos saw in the shattered glass, the outline of a figure at the end of the hallway. He turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. "We can't live like this anymore," Julia said, holding back tears. "We really need help." The next day, they returned to Donna Esther, begging for guidance. The old woman greeted them with the same grave look as before. "I warned you. Once the basement door is opened, the house never really leaves you. You carry it with you, like a shadow that won't go away." "But there must be something we can do," Marcos insisted. "Some way to end this." Donna Esther hesitated for a moment before answering. "There is a ritual, but it's not guaranteed, and it's dangerous. It involves going back to the house and facing what you've released." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. The idea of returning to that place was terrifying, but living under the constant feeling of fear was also unbearable. "What do we need to do?" she asked with determination. "You must seal the cellar again, but not just physically. You must perform the banishing ritual to weaken what is inside, and above all, never leave the door open again." Mrs. Esther handed them an old book, full of notes and detailed instructions. She warned, "This will take courage. The entity will fight you. It will try to manipulate you. But if you do not complete the ritual, its presence will be even stronger and inescapable." With heavy hearts, but determined to end the torment, Julia and Marcos prepared to return to the house. They knew that this would be the longest and most terrifying night of their lives, but also the only chance to regain peace. However, as they drove to the abandoned house under the cover of night, they both felt the same chill, as if something was already waiting for them, eager to start over the game that should never have started. The return to the haunted house. The road that led to the house seemed longer than ever. The silence in the car was heavy, full of apprehension. Julia and Marcos knew that what they would face that night would be beyond anything they could have imagined. Fear had already become a constant part of their lives, but now, in that moment, it was more palpable than ever. When they arrived, the house stood before them like a dark sentinel, its empty windows watching them menacingly. The facade that had previously looked merely old and neglected now had an aura of hostility, as if it was eagerly awaiting their arrival. Julia took a deep breath and looked at Marcos. "Are we ready?" she asked, her voice hoarse. He didn't answer right away. The weight of the situation was clear in his eyes. But finally, he nodded. Let's do this together. They got out of the car and walked to the front door. The wind seemed stronger, and the sound of their footsteps echoed disconcertingly in the emptiness of the house. Everything seemed completely silent, until the door creaked open as if the house were welcoming anyone who dared to enter. Inside, the house seemed even darker and more oppressive. Each step seemed more difficult than the last, as if the air was thick, charged with something invisible and threatening. They continued to the hallway where the stairs to the basement awaited them. Marcos was the first to go down, holding the flashlight tightly. Julia followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. They couldn't go back now. The basement was waiting for them, and the ritual would have to be performed there, where it all began. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, the air was so cold that their breath condensed in the air. The dirt floor was intact, but there was a sense of something evil in the air. The ancient table was still there, along with the ritual objects that had been found before. But there was something different. The air was heavier, as if something had been released and was now waiting for her next action. Julia took Donna Esther's book from her bag and began searching for the ritual page. Her hands were sweaty and shaking, but she forced herself to continue, feeling the weight of it all on her shoulders. "Let's begin," Marcos said, his voice tense. He knew that at any moment they could be interrupted, that something would try to stop the ritual, but he had no choice. They had to do this, or they would never have peace. As Julia recited the words of the ritual, the shadows around them began to move. It was as if the basement itself was coming to life, the walls seeming to bend and stretch toward them. The sound of children's laughter, low and sinister, returned, echoing throughout the basement, making both of their blood run cold. Marcos tried to concentrate on the words, but the dark presence seemed to be getting closer. He felt a cold hand touch his shoulder, and when he turned, he saw a shadow materializing in front of him. It was the same figure they had seen that night when they first opened the basement. His eyes glowed like two red lamps, and his laughter echoed in Julia and Marcos's ears like a macabre melody. "They won't make it," the entity's voice whispered, slurred and demonic. "The door has been opened. It's too late now." Julia, desperate, continued to recite the words, her voice almost lost in the chaos around her. But something inside her made her believe that they were close to finishing. They could feel the strength of the ritual beginning to take shape, a resistance beginning to form around them. Suddenly, a burst of light blinded them. The entire basement shook, as if it were being swallowed by an invisible force. The chains on the basement door began to shake, creaking in an eerie way. The entity, now clearly furious, tried to advance, but an invisible barrier stopped it. "We're almost there," Julia said, her voice breathless, her eyes fixed on the book. Marcos felt an intense pain in his head, as if 1,000 blades of ice were piercing his brain. He screamed, but continued, determined to help in any way he could. "We can't stop." As the last word of the ritual was spoken, the house seemed to succumb to a deep tremor. A deafening roar came from deep within the basement, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The shadows began to dissipate, and the ghostly figure collapsed, disappearing as if it had never existed. The silence that followed was absolute. The basement was at peace, but at a high price. The chains on the basement door fell away, as if they had finally been released, and the sense of threat, though still present, seemed less intense. Julia and Marcos, exhausted and shaken, knew that whatever had haunted them had been defeated, but not without leaving its mark. They were free of the house, but not of the terror they had faced. The ritual had sealed the basement, but the curse of the house would never completely leave them. That night, as they left the house for the last time, Julia looked at Marcos and whispered, "Now can we finally live in peace?" Marcos hugged her, but his gaze was distant. "I don't know, but at least now we have a chance." Well, we're already uncovering more and more of this story, but before I continue, I realize that you haven't liked this video yet. This is very important for YouTube to help promote our content. So please like this video, which is free, okay? Let's move on. The house behind them fell silent, its threat still present in the shadows, waiting for another curious person to open the door. As Julia and Marcos walked away from the house, the weight of the experience still hung over them, but there was at least some relief. For a moment, it seemed like the nightmare had finally come to an end, but there was a disturbing feeling that the evil would not disappear completely. After all, old curses are not easily broken. They persist, they wait, and one day they may return stronger than before. As the two disappeared into the darkness of the road, the house remained there, watching them with its empty eyes, waiting for its next victim. And as Donna Esther warned, whoever dares to step into its territory may have more than just a story to tell. Maybe even something more. Something that will not be easy to forget. And you? What would you do if you knew that a house, a basement, could hold such a deep secret? Would you investigate? Would you risk everything for a mystery? Or, like Julia and Marcos, would you be left with the feeling that some doors, even after being closed, are never really locked? This story is just one of many that hide in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. If you felt goosebumps, if this mystery is still haunting your mind, it is because there is much more to explore. Who knows what is waiting in some dark corner waiting for you? If you like this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because believe me, this isn't the last haunted house or mystery you'll see here. Get ready, because more stories like this are about to happen. And maybe the next one will be even scarier than you imagined. Stay tuned, and until next time.